the widow who taught an old cowboy to hope again. The first time Jonah Whitaker said his heart had already lived its finest days, Mara Bell did not argue with him. She only looked at him across the porch rail, with the late Arizona sun turning her silver hair to gold, and said, "Then give me one chance to prove you wrong." Jonah had faced winter storms, stampeding cattle, broken bones, empty pockets, and the long, slow ache of burying the woman he had loved for 38 years. But those few quiet words from Mara Bell frightened him more than any danger he had ever known. Because hope, when a man had stopped expecting it, could feel almost like a threat. At 66, Jonah lived alone on Cottonwood Bend Ranch, a tired piece of land outside the small town of Mercy Ridge. The ranch had once been full of noise, children running through the yard, a milk cow complaining at dawn, his wife, Ruth, calling from the kitchen window that supper was getting cold, a fiddle tune on Saturday nights when the work was done and the lanterns burned low. Now the house mostly listened to itself. The floorboards creaked when no one walked on them. The wind moved through the eaves like a person sighing in another room. One chair sat at the kitchen table, always pulled out, always waiting for a woman who had been gone 7 years. Jonah still rose before sunrise because old habits were harder to kill than weeds. He fed the horses, checked the fences, patched what needed patching, and cooked the same dry meals in the same black skillet. Beans, coffee, hard bread, sometimes bacon if he remembered to buy it. He ate standing by the stove more often than sitting, because sitting at a table built for two made a man too aware of who was not there. His 3 children wrote when they could. His eldest son, Matthew, ran a freight business in Prescott. His daughter Annie lived near Santa Fe with a husband and 4 children of her own. His youngest, Cole, had gone north to work cattle and sent letters with dust pressed into the folds. They loved him, Jonah never doubted that. But loving a man from far away did not fill a chair beside him at supper. So he learned to be quiet. He spoke to his old bay horse Sunday more than he spoke to neighbors. He went into Mercy Ridge only when supplies ran low, and even then he moved through town like a man trying not to leave footprints. Flour, coffee, nails, salt, then back to the ranch before anyone asked him how he was getting on. Folks called him steady, dependable, private. They did not know that private was just another word for lonely, when no one was close enough to hear the truth. Mara Bell arrived in Mercy Ridge in early September, riding in a hired wagon with 2 trunks, a sewing basket, and a clay pot of dead lavender she refused to throw away. She was 61, widowed 5 years, and had come west to be near her niece, Eliza, who was expecting her first child and needed more courage than advice. Eliza wanted Mara to move straight into the spare room. Mara kissed her cheek and said, "A woman my age needs her own door to close." So she rented a small adobe house near the edge of town, where the road bent toward the church and the desert opened wide beyond the last fence. She took work 3 afternoons a week at Harlan's Dry Goods, folding calico, measuring sugar, and pretending she needed the wages more than the company. Mara had known loneliness too, though she wore it differently than Jonah. She did not hide from people. She smiled, asked after babies, remembered who liked cinnamon candy and who bought tobacco on credit. But at night, when the little house grew still, she would sit by the window with mending in her lap and forget to push the needle through the cloth. Her husband, Abram, had been a kind man with rough hands and a soft singing voice. After he died, everyone told Mara she was strong. They said it so often she began to feel there was no room left for her to be tired. So she kept moving. She cared for a sick sister, helped a nephew through harvest, stayed with a neighbor after childbirth, cooked, cleaned, soothed, mended, packed, unpacked, and smiled when people said they did not know what they would do without her. Only now in Mercy Ridge, for the first time in her grown life, no one truly needed her every hour of the day. That freedom should have felt like a gift. Instead, it sat in her hands like an object she did not know how to use. She met Jonah properly on a cold Saturday morning when half the town gathered to repair the roof of the little white church after a summer storm had torn shingles loose. Men climbed ladders with hammers tucked in their belts. Women set out coffee, biscuits, and apple butter on long boards balanced over barrels. Children chased each other through dust until somebody's mother caught them by the collar. Jonah worked at the far back corner of the roof, away from the laughter. He had chosen the hardest section on purpose. A man left alone with difficult work did not have to make conversation. Mara noticed him before noon. Not because he was handsome, though he still had the kind of face that made a person look twice. Weathered, stern, brown from sun, with gray hair under his hat and shoulders still broad enough to carry more than he ought to. She noticed him because he had passed the food table 3 times without taking a plate. By the 4th time, she wrapped 2 biscuits and a slice of ham in a cloth, climbed 3 rungs of the ladder, and held it up. "You forgot breakfast," she said. Jonah looked down, hammer in hand. "Didn't forget." "Then you neglected it on purpose, which is worse." "I don't need fussing over, ma'am." Mara lifted the cloth a little higher. "Good. I don't fuss over strangers. I feed stubborn men before they fall off church roofs and make work for the doctor." A few men nearby chuckled. Jonah's jaw tightened, but he took the food. "Much obliged." "You are welcome, Mr. Whitaker." He paused. "You know my name." "I work at Harlan S. Everyone knows your name. You buy flour, coffee, nails, and nothing that suggests you enjoy supper." One corner of Jonah's mouth moved, almost against his will. Mara saw it and wisely said nothing more. She stepped down from the ladder, brushed dust from her skirt, and returned to the table. Jonah watched her go longer than he meant to. That should have been the end of it. A biscuit, a few sharp words, a strange little warmth in his chest that he could blame on the sun if he cared to lie to himself. But near dusk, when the roof was mended and neighbors began packing away tools, Jonah found his eyes searching the churchyard. Mara stood beside the coffee table, tying a cloth around leftover bread. The wind tugged at the loose strands of hair near her cheek. She looked tired but not weak. There was a difference, and Jonah knew it. He was turning away when a young boy ran past the table and struck one of the barrels. The plank tipped. The coffee pot slid. Jonah moved before anyone shouted. He caught the pot by its iron handle, hot enough to sting through his glove, and steadied the plank with his knee. Mara froze with one hand pressed to her chest. For one breath, they stood close enough that Jonah could see a tiny scar near her thumb, pale as a thread. "That was quick," she said softly. "Old habit," Jonah answered. "Saving coffee. Saving what can still be saved." The words came out before he thought better of them. Mara's expression changed just a little. Not pity. Jonah hated pity and could smell it quicker than rain. This was something quieter, something like understanding. Then the church bell, loosened by all the hammering, gave a sudden low sound above them. Both of them looked up. When Jonah looked back, Mara was still watching him. For the first time in 7 years, he did not hurry away from a woman's gaze. That evening, Jonah rode home under a sky streaked red and purple, with a parcel of leftover biscuits tied behind his saddle. The desert cooled around him. Sunday's hooves struck the road in a slow, familiar rhythm. The ranch appeared ahead, dark against the last light, with one lantern burning in the kitchen window because Jonah always lit it before leaving, so the house would not look dead when he returned. Usually, that lantern made him sad. Tonight, for reasons he did not trust, it made him think of Mara Bell standing in the wind, asking nothing from him except that he eat before hunger made a fool of him. He unsaddled Sunday, rubbed him down, and carried the biscuits inside. The kitchen smelled of cold ashes and old wood. One chair waited at the table. Jonah set the parcel down across from it. Then he stood very still. It was a foolish thing, putting food in front of an empty chair, foolish enough that he almost snatched it back. But he did not. Outside, the wind moved along the porch, rattling the dry cottonwood leaves like whispers. Jonah stared at the empty chair, at the wrapped biscuits, at the faint dust on the floor where no second pair of boots had crossed in years. Then, in a voice so low even the house seemed to lean close to hear it, he said, "Don't start thinking foolish things, old man." But his hand trembled when he reached for the coffee pot. And long after supper, long after the lantern burned low, Jonah Whitaker sat awake at the table, troubled by one simple truth. For the first time in years, he was looking forward to going back to town. Jonah told himself he went into Mercy Ridge the next Wednesday because he needed lamp oil. That was only half true. The bottle beside his stove still had enough oil to last another week if he trimmed the wick carefully. He also did not need brown sugar, coffee, or the small packet of cinnamon he picked up and set down 3 times before finally placing it on Harlan's counter. Jonah Whitaker had never cared much for cinnamon. Ruth had once used it in apple cakes when the children were young, and after she died, he stopped buying it because the smell made the house ache. Yet there it sat among his supplies, accusing him like a witness. Mara Bell stood behind the counter, measuring ribbon for Mrs. Carver, who was telling a long story about her rooster getting into the wash tub. Mara listened with patience, but when Jonah stepped through the door, her eyes lifted. She did not smile wide. That would have made him turn around and leave. She only gave him a small nod, as if she had expected him, though there was no reason she should have. Jonah removed his hat. "Afternoon." "Mr. Whitaker," Mara said, "you are late for a man who buys the same things every Wednesday morning. I had a fence down near the North Wash." "Did the fence apologize for delaying you?" "No, ma'am." "Then I hope you spoke sternly to it." Mrs. Carver laughed. Jonah looked at the floor, but Mara saw the faintest crease at the corner of his mouth. It was not much, but it was more than Mercy Ridge usually got from him. When Mrs. Carver left, the store grew quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock and the soft scrape of Mara folding cloth. Jonah placed his items on the counter. Mara looked at them one by one: lamp oil, coffee, brown sugar, cinnamon. Jonah stared at the cinnamon packet as though it had arrived there without his consent. "For saddle sores," he said. Mara's hands paused. Then she looked up slowly. "You put cinnamon on saddle sores." Jonah's ears warmed beneath his hat brim. "No." "I was about to say, I have known many cowboys to be foolish, but that would be a fresh kind." He cleared his throat. "Might make apple cakes." The word surprised them both. Mara's expression softened, but she did not crowd him with tenderness. "That's so." "Might not." "That sounds safer." He paid for the supplies, but instead of leaving at once, he stood with his hand on the wrapped parcel. Outside, a wagon rolled by, wheels crunching over the dry street. A horse shifted at the hitching rail, its harness creaking. Jonah could feel the old habit pulling at him, telling him to get out before anyone stepped too near whatever had opened inside him. Mara reached beneath the counter and brought out a small paper packet tied with string. Jonah frowned. "What's that?" "Nutmeg." "I didn't ask for nutmeg." "No, but if you are brave enough to attempt apple cakes after 7 years of beans and black coffee, you will need help." "I never said 7 years." "You did not have to." The quiet between them changed. Jonah looked toward the window. A thin line of dust moved across the street, lifted by the wind. He wished suddenly that he had not come. Then, just as suddenly, he was glad he had. "How much?" he asked. Mara shook her head. "Consider it a kindness." "I don't take charity." It is not charity, it is encouragement. I don't take that either. This time Mara smiled. Then consider it a debt. You can repay me by not burning down Cottonwood Bend. Against his better judgment, Jonah took the packet. On the ride home, the cinnamon and nutmeg sat in his saddlebag like two small pieces of trouble. He tried to think about the fence line. He tried to think about the calf with the white face that kept slipping through the lower rails. But his mind returned to Mara's voice, to the way she had said encouragement as if it were something a man could hold in his palm. That evening, Jonah stood in his kitchen and attempted apple cakes from memory. The first batch stuck to the pan. The second was too dry. The third looked passable if a man did not inspect it too closely. The kitchen filled with the warm smell of apples, sugar, and spice, and the scent struck Jonah so hard he had to put one hand on the stove. For a moment, he was not 66. He was 32, standing behind Ruth while she rolled dough with flour on her cheek. Matthew was small enough to sit on the table. Annie was stealing apple slices from a bowl. Cole had not yet been born. Ruth was humming, which usually meant Jonah had done something wrong and she had not yet decided how to say it. The memory hurt, but it did not crush him. That was new. Jonah sat at the table with one poor-looking apple cake on a chipped plate. The other chair stood across from him. He stared at it for a long while, then reached over and set a second cake there. "Don't mean anything," he muttered. But the house did not believe him. The next Sunday, he arrived at church 10 minutes earlier than usual. He told himself it was because the new roof deserved inspecting after the week's wind. He walked around the building, checked the eaves, studied the shingles, and found nothing wrong. When he stepped inside, Mara Bell was already seated near the middle pew, gloved hands folded over a small Bible. There were plenty of empty benches. Jonah knew that, Mara knew it too. Still, he walked to the pew where she sat and stopped at the aisle. "Seat taken?" he asked. Mara looked at the empty space beside her. By pride, perhaps, but pride can move over. Jonah sat. Neither of them looked at each other during the first hymn, but when the congregation rose, Jonah heard Mara's voice beside him. It was low and steady, not polished, not trying to impress anyone. Just a woman singing because the words had found a place inside her. Jonah did not sing. He had not sung since Ruth's funeral. But by the final verse, his fingers had loosened around the brim of his hat. After service, several neighbors lingered in the yard. Children chased one another between wagons. Men talked weather. Women passed news as gently as folded linen. Jonah meant to leave. Then Mara stopped beside him near the gate. "Did the apple cake survive?" she asked. Jonah looked startled. "Mostly." That is not a confident answer. "One batch died honorably." "And the others?" "Could hold a door open in a strong wind." Mara laughed then, not loudly, but with such honest delight that Jonah forgot for one breath to be guarded. "You may bring me one next time," she said. "I wouldn't punish you that way. I am not easily frightened." "No," Jonah said before he could stop himself. "I don't expect you are." The words settled between them, with more weight than he intended. Mara looked away first, toward the road leading out of town. A softness crossed her face, touched by something private and old. "My husband used to say I was fearless," she said. "He was wrong. I was only good at doing what needed doing while afraid." Jonah understood that better than he wished to. He wanted to ask her about him. Abraham, the man who had left her with quiet evenings and a dead lavender plant she still watered sometimes out of habit. But before Jonah could speak, a rider came hard down the road from the south, his horse lathered and breathing sharp. The churchyard turned. The rider drew up fast, dust rolling around him. "Mr. Whitaker," he called, "you best get home quick. Smoke's rising near Cottonwood Bend." Jonah's heart struck hard against his ribs. For one terrible second, he thought of the stove, the apple cakes, the old dry curtains near the kitchen window. Then he thought of Sunday in the barn. He was already moving when Mara caught his sleeve. "I'm coming," she said. "No." "Yes. It may be dangerous." Mara's hand tightened just once, firm and calm. "Then you should not face it alone." Jonah looked at her, ready to argue, but the smoke was rising somewhere beyond the church roof, thin and dark against the bright afternoon sky. And for the first time in years, when trouble called him home, he was not riding toward it by himself. Jonah rode hard enough that Sunday tossed his head in protest, but the old horse knew the way home and understood fear in a rider's hands. Mara followed in a borrowed buckboard driven by Eli Turner, the young man who had brought the warning. The wheels struck stones and ruts, throwing dust behind them in a long brown tail. Mara gripped the side rail with one hand and held her bonnet with the other, her eyes fixed on the dark thread of smoke rising beyond the cottonwoods. "It may only be brush," Eli said, though his voice did not sound convinced. Mara did not answer. She watched Jonah ahead of them, bent low over Sunday's neck, his coat snapping behind him. Even from that distance, she could see the fear in the set of his shoulders. Not fear for land. Fear for what little he had left. When the ranch came into view, Jonah pulled up so sharply Sunday slid in the dirt. Smoke curled from behind the barn, thick and gray, but the house still stood untouched. The barn doors were open, and two frightened calves bawled from the corral. A patch of dry grass near the hay shed had caught, flames crawling low but hungry toward a stacked wall of winter feed. Jonah was off his horse before the dust settled. "Sunday, stay," he snapped, though the horse was too nervous to do anything but dance in place. Mara climbed down before Eli could help her. "Water barrels." "Beside the wash rack," Jonah called. He ran for a shovel leaning against the barn and began throwing dirt over the edge of the fire. Eli seized a bucket. Mara found the barrels, plunged both hands into cold water up to her wrists, and filled as fast as she could. The first bucket was too heavy, but she dragged it half the distance before Jonah reached for it. "I have it," he said. "So do I," she answered. There was no time to argue. For the next several minutes, the three of them fought the fire in a rhythm without words. Jonah beat back the flames with dirt. Eli hauled water. Mara soaked old feed sacks and slapped them against sparks that jumped the line. Smoke stung her eyes. Heat pressed against her face. The wind shifted once toward the hay shed, and Jonah gave a sound that was almost a prayer. "Not there," he said. "Lord, not there." Mara heard it. She also heard the crack of wood near the back corner of the shed. "Jonah!" A loose board had caught. Flame licked up its edge, small but quick. Jonah turned, saw it, and ran straight toward it. Mara moved after him without thinking. He struck the board with the shovel, knocking it loose, but a shower of sparks burst down. Mara threw the soaked sack over the corner and pressed hard. The smoke wrapped around them both. Jonah grabbed her arm and pulled her back just as the burned board fell. They stumbled into the dirt together. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Jonah looked at her hand. The heel of her palm was red, where a spark had kissed through the wet cloth. "You're burned," he said. "It is nothing." "It is not nothing. The barn is still standing." His eyes held hers, fierce and shaken. "That does not make it nothing." Mara looked away first because his worry reached a place in her she had kept carefully closed. For years, people had needed her steady, useful, willing. They thanked her after the danger passed. They called her strong. But very few had looked at one small hurt on her hand as if it mattered all by itself. By the time neighbors arrived with more buckets and shovels, the worst had passed. The fire was beaten down to black patches and smoke. The hay shed had survived. So had the barn. The house stood beyond it, quiet and pale in the afternoon light. Jonah stood with his hands on his hips, breathing hard, gray hair damp at his temples. His face had gone ashen beneath the dust. Eli walked the burned ground and frowned. This didn't start from lightning. There was no lightning, Jonah said. No stove ash this far from the house either. Mara looked toward the fence line, where the dry grass gave way to open scrub. Near one post, something pale caught her eye. She walked over and bent down. It was a torn strip of cloth caught on a splinter, not feed sack, not old canvas. Fine cotton, dark blue, with a tiny brass button still hanging by a thread. Jonah came up behind her. What is it? Mara held it out. He took it slowly. His thumb brushed the brass button. That doesn't belong here. Could someone have passed through? Jonah's gaze lifted toward the ridge beyond the ranch. Plenty could pass. Few would come close enough to the hay shed by accident. Eli swallowed. You think somebody said it? Jonah did not answer at once. The wind moved over the blackened ground, stirring ash around their boots. Mara saw something close over his face. Not only anger, something older, heavier. A man remembering every loss and preparing himself for another. Go tell Sheriff Darden, Jonah said to Eli. Ask him to ride out before dark. Eli nodded and hurried for the buckboard. Mara expected Jonah to turn toward the house, but he remained where he was, staring at the strip of cloth in his hand. You saved the hay, she said gently. His jaw tightened. For now. You saved the barn. For now. In the house. Jonah turned then, and the pain in his eyes was so naked she almost stepped back. You don't understand, he said. That house is the last place Ruth breathed. That barn still has notches on the doorframe where my children measured themselves. That rosebush by the porch was planted the year Annie was born. If fire takes it, it does not just take wood. Mara's voice softened. I do understand. He looked away, ashamed of the sharpness in his tone. Forgive me. There is nothing to forgive. There is. You came to help, and I spoke as though grief belonged only to me. Mara held her burned hand against her skirt. Grief makes people guard old rooms like no one else has ever stood inside one. Jonah looked at her then, truly looked. The smoke had loosened strands of hair around her face. Dust marked her cheek. Her hand trembled, though she tried to hide it. And yet she stood beside him not as a visitor, not as a woman seeking thanks, but as someone willing to remain after the danger had made staying difficult. Something inside him shifted. Not healed. Not settled. Only moved. He led her to the porch and brought a basin of cool water. His hands, rough from rope and weather, were careful as he poured. Mara lowered her palm into the water and drew a small breath. Hurt bad? He asked. I have had worse from cast iron. Still should be tended. You are fussing, Mr. Whitaker. Yes, Jonah said quietly. I expect I am. Mara did not tease him after that. For a while they sat side by side on the porch steps, watching the last smoke fade behind the barn. The sun slipped lower, turning the burned ground copper and black. A horse shifted near the rail. Somewhere inside the house, a clock ticked through the open window. If this small act of courage touched your heart, stay with Jonah and Mara, because the fire was only the beginning of what Mercy Ridge had been hiding. When Sheriff Darden finally rode in near dusk, he studied the burned patch, the fence line, and the torn blue cloth with a troubled frown. Then he turned to Jonah. Found something like this last month over at Miller's place, he said. Jonah went still. You never told me. Didn't know it meant anything then. And now? The sheriff looked toward the hills, where the fading light made every mesquite shadow seem like a crouched figure. Now, he said, I think somebody has been choosing lonely ranches on purpose." Mara felt Jonah's shoulder brush hers. Neither of them moved away. The sheriff's words stayed on Jonah's porch long after Sheriff Darden rode away. Somebody has been choosing lonely ranches on purpose. Mara stood at the porch rail, her burned hand wrapped in a clean strip of linen Jonah had torn from an old shirt. The cloth was too large and tied too carefully. Jonah had frowned the whole time he wrapped it, as though blaming himself for every spark that had touched her skin. Now he stood beside the steps with the torn blue cloth in one hand and his rifle in the other. Mara watched him check the yard for the third time. "You expect trouble tonight?" she asked. "I expect nothing good from men who set fires behind barns. Sheriff Darden said he would send a deputy by morning. Morning is a long way off." The sky above Cottonwood Bend had gone purple, and the first stars showed pale over the ridge. The burned patch near the hay shed still smoked in thin gray breaths. Every now and then, the wind carried the sharp smell of ash to the porch. Mara should have gone back to town with the sheriff. Jonah had said so twice. She had ignored him both times. Eli Turner had promised to bring her buckboard back in the morning, and Sheriff Darden offered to escort her home. But Mara looked at the blackened ground, the worried horses, and Jonah standing in the yard like a man bracing against a whole winter alone. Then she heard herself say, "I'll stay until the moon is up." Jonah argued. Mara listened politely. Then she went inside and put coffee on the stove. That had settled it. Now the ranch house glowed with lamplight behind them. It looked different with two people moving through it. Not full, not yet, but awake. Mara had noticed the careful order of the kitchen, the stacked plates, the swept floor, the single cup by the basin. A man could keep a house neat and still leave it starving for life. On the wall near the stove hung a faded sampler stitched with blue thread. Ruth's work, Mara guessed. Above the mantel sat a photograph of a younger Jonah beside a dark-haired woman with laughing eyes. 3 children stood in front of them, stiff and serious in their Sunday clothes. Mara had looked at the photograph only a moment, but Jonah saw. "That was Ruth," he said too quickly. "I know." His eyes narrowed with old fear. "Folks in town talk too much." "No," her face told me. "A woman loved by a house has a way of remaining in it." Jonah said nothing after that. But he did not turn the photograph away. A little later, they sat at the kitchen table with coffee between them. Jonah chose the chair nearest the stove. Mara sat across from him, in the chair he had not used for anything but memory in 7 years. At first, he looked at it more than he looked at her. Mara noticed, but she did not move. Some chairs had to be claimed gently, not avoided forever. The clock ticked. Outside, Sunday stamped in the barn. A loose shutter tapped once against the wall, then stilled. "Do you know anyone who might want to harm you?" Mara asked. Jonah rubbed his thumb along the coffee cup. "I've had disagreements. Every rancher has. Disagreements do not usually come with matches." "No." He leaned back, weary now that the danger had passed enough to let exhaustion find him. "There's a man named Wade Cresswell. Owns the Broken Star spread east of here. Been trying to buy up water rights along the wash. Offered for mine twice. And you refused." "Ruth loved this place. My children were raised on it. I told him no." "Did he take it poorly?" Jonah gave a dry laugh. "Men like Cresswell always take no poorly. They just dress it in polite words first." Mara wrapped both hands around her cup, careful of the bandage. Could the cloth belong to him? "Too fine for Cresswell. He dresses plain to make folks think he is honest." Jonah looked toward the window. "But he hires men who care more for money than conscience." Mara was quiet. Jonah caught the silence. "You're frightened." "Yes. I told you that you should have gone home." "I am frightened, Jonah. I am not useless." He looked at her, surprised by his name in her mouth. She had called him Mr. Whitaker until now. The change was small, but it crossed the room like a match struck in darkness. Mara seemed to realize it too. Color touched her cheeks, but she did not take it back. Jonah lowered his gaze to the table. "I never thought you useless." "Good. Then do not speak as if danger gives you the right to send me where I do not choose to go." A silence followed. Then Jonah said, "Ruth used to say I had a talent for deciding what was best for people who had not asked me." Mara's mouth softened. "Abram used to say I had a talent for making people regret doing that." Jonah gave a quiet huff that was almost laughter. For a moment, the night outside did not feel as large. Then a sound came from the yard. Both of them froze. It was not a horse, not the wind, not the settling of old wood. A small scrape, like a boot shifting on gravel. Jonah rose in one smooth motion, rifle in hand. Mara stood too. "Stay behind me," he whispered. This time Mara did not argue. There was courage and there was foolishness. She knew the difference. Jonah moved to the side of the window, keeping out of the lamplight. Mara reached for the lamp, turned it low, and the kitchen fell into a dim amber hush. Another scrape came near the porch. Jonah's face hardened. He stepped to the door and called, "Who's out there?" No answer. Then something struck the porch boards with a dull thud. Mara drew in a breath. Jonah waited, rifle raised but not pointed wild. After a long moment, he opened the door just enough to see. A stone lay near the threshold, wrapped in paper and tied with twine. The yard beyond was empty. Jonah stepped out fast, scanning the shadows. Mara followed to the doorway, her heart beating high in her throat. The desert held still beneath the moon, too still to be trusted. "Jonah," she said softly. He picked up the stone and paper, then backed inside. He set the rifle against the wall but kept it close. The paper was dirty, folded unevenly, the twine knotted hard. Mara watched his fingers work at it. Inside was a message written in thick black pencil. "Leave the old places empty, or they burn." The words seemed to make the whole kitchen colder. Jonah stared at the paper without speaking. Mara looked from the warning to the empty chair she occupied, then to Ruth's photograph on the mantel. Leave the old places empty. It was not only a threat against land. It was aimed at grief, at memory, at the fear that any new warmth in an old house was a kind of betrayal. Jonah folded the note once, carefully, as if he feared what he might do if he moved too quickly. "I'll ride for the sheriff." "Not alone in the dark," Mara said. "I know this land. So does whoever threw that stone." His eyes lifted to hers. The argument faded before it began. He knew she was right. They barred the door. Jonah checked each window. Mara took the poker from beside the stove and set it near her chair, which made Jonah look at her with one raised brow. "What?" she said. "I said I was not useless." That time he did laugh, soft and brief, but real enough to warm the room for a heartbeat. They did not sleep. Jonah sat by the window with the rifle across his knees. Mara sat at the table with her bandaged hand resting near the cooling coffee. The note lay between them. Hours passed slowly. The moon climbed. Coyotes called somewhere beyond the wash. Once, Mara's eyes grew heavy and her head dipped. Jonah removed his coat and placed it gently around her shoulders. She woke at the touch. "You'll be cold," she murmured. "I've been cold before." The coat smelled of smoke, leather, sun, and something simply his. Mara pulled it closer without meaning to. Jonah looked away, but not before she saw the tenderness he tried to hide. Near dawn, when the sky turned pale behind the hills, Mara spoke into the quiet. "Ruth is not gone from this house because I sat in her chair." Jonah went still. Mara kept her eyes on the window. And Abram is not gone from my heart because I wanted someone to worry over my burned hand. Jonah's grip tightened on the rifle, but his voice, when it came, was low and rough. Wanting is the part I don't trust. Why? Because wanting asks a man to reach, and reaching gives the world another thing to take. Mara turned toward him then, or another thing to give back. The first light touched her face, showing the tired lines around her eyes, the dust still on her collar, the bandage at her hand, the brave softness she had not let the years steal from her. Jonah looked at her for a long time. Then hooves sounded on the road. He stood quickly and went to the door. Mara rose behind him. A rider came fast through the dawn dust, but it was not Sheriff Darden. It was a younger man in a dark coat, hat pulled low, riding a chestnut horse with a white blaze. Jonah's face changed before Mara understood why. The rider stopped at the gate and swung down stiffly, eyes moving from the burned ground to Mara standing in Jonah's doorway wearing Jonah's coat. His mouth tightened. "Pa," he said. Jonah lowered the rifle slowly. Mara felt the morning turn heavy. Because the man at the gate was not an outlaw. He was Jonah's eldest son, Matthew Whitaker. And from the look in his eyes, he had brought a different kind of fire with him. Matthew Whitaker did not step through his father's gate like a son coming home. He stood outside it for a long moment, one hand resting on the top rail, his eyes moving over the burned patch behind the barn, the open ranch door, and Mara Bell standing on the porch with Jonah's coat around her shoulders. The dawn was cold and pale. Smoke still clung low to the ground in thin gray ribbons. Sunday shifted near the hitching post, ears turned forward, sensing the trouble in human silence. Jonah walked down from the porch slowly. "Matthew." "Pa." There was no embrace. Mara noticed that first. Noticed it with the sharp ache of a woman who had spent years watching families speak around pain instead of through it. Matthew was a tall man in his early 40s, clean-shaven, with his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. His coat was finer than most ranch men wore, brushed free of dust except where the road had claimed it. He looked tired from travel, but anger kept him upright. "I got a letter from Mrs. Hanley," Matthew said. "She wrote that you'd been seen keeping company with a widow from town." Jonah's face hardened. Mrs. Hanley should put more care into her quilting and less into my porch. She also wrote folks have been talking. Folks talk when rain falls and when it doesn't. Matthew's eyes cut toward Mara, and is this her? Jonah's voice went low. "Mind your tone." Mara stepped down one porch stair before either man could make the morning worse. "I am Mara Bell. I wish your first sight of me had come under kinder circumstances." Matthew removed his hat because manners had survived where gentleness had not. "Ma'am." But he did not offer his hand. Mara accepted the insult without showing the wound. She had learned long ago that some people needed time to remember who they wanted to be. Matthew looked again at the coat around her shoulders. "I see you've made yourself comfortable." Jonah took one step forward. "That is enough." "No, Pa, I don't think it is." Matthew's voice cracked at the edge, and that crack told Mara more than his anger did. "I ride half the night after hearing my father has taken up with a stranger, and I find smoke in the yard and her wearing your coat before sunrise. She helped save the barn." "Did she?" The word struck harder than a slap. Jonah's hand curled at his side. "You'll not speak that way to a woman who stood in smoke while you were still miles from here." Matthew's face flushed. For a moment shame moved through his eyes, then pride covered it like dust over a footprint. "I'm not here to quarrel over manners," he said. "I'm here because this ranch is still Whitaker land, Mother's land. You may not care what people think, but I do." Jonah stared at him. "Your mother has been gone 7 years. I know how long she's been gone." Then why speak as if she might come out of that kitchen and ask who sat at her table? Matthew looked toward the house, and all the anger in him seemed to lose its direction. Mara saw it then. His fury was not really aimed at her. It was aimed at the open door, the old kitchen, the chair she had sat in, the father who had somehow begun to live again while his son was away learning how to miss him. "I should go," Mara said quietly. Jonah turned. "No. It is morning now. Sheriff Darden will come soon. Your son has ridden far, and this is family business." Matthew gave a short, bitter laugh. "At least someone understands." Jonah looked at him sharply. "Matthew." Mara held up one hand, the bandaged one, and Jonah fell silent. She returned his coat with care. Her fingers brushed the worn wool at the collar before she passed it to him. The gesture was small, but Jonah felt it like farewell. "Thank you for tending my hand," she said. "You should let the doctor look at it." "I will." He wanted to say more. The words crowded behind his teeth. "Stay. Let him rage. Let me prove I am not ashamed of you." But Matthew stood at the gate with old grief burning in his face, and Mara's eyes told Jonah she would not be made into a weapon between father and son. So she stepped past him and walked toward town on foot, because the buckboard was not there, and because pride sometimes carried a woman farther than wheels. Jonah watched her until the road bent, and she disappeared behind the cottonwoods. Only then did he turn back to Matthew. "You came at a poor time," he said. "I can see that." "No," Jonah said, "you cannot." He handed Matthew the warning note from the night before. Matthew read it once, then again. The color drained from his face. "Who sent this?" "Don't know yet." Matthew looked toward the burned ground. This was set. "Sheriff thinks so." "And you let her stay here with you after that?" "She chose to stay after helping fight the fire." "She should not have been here at all." "Neither were you." The words landed between them like a dropped plate. Matthew looked at his father, hurt plain now, anger stripped thin. "That's what this is." Jonah's shoulders sagged. "No, but don't stand on my land at dawn accusing a good woman of wrongdoing because your conscience found you too late." Matthew took a step back as if struck. For a while neither man spoke. The sun rose higher, touching the barn roof with pale gold. In the quiet, a rooster called from somewhere down the road. Jonah folded the note and tucked it into his vest. "When your mother died," he said at last, "you had a business to run. Annie had babies. Cole had work up north. I told all of you I was fine. You always said that." "I lied." Matthew looked away. Jonah's voice roughened. "I lied because I thought that was fatherhood, to keep the worst of it off your backs. But the lie got comfortable. Then the house got quiet. Then 1 year became 7, and I was still telling everyone I was fine because I did not know how to say I had forgotten how to be anything else." Matthew swallowed hard. "Why didn't you write?" "I did about fences, whether calves, flour prices." "That is not what I mean." "I know." A horse approached from the road before either could continue. Sheriff Darden rode in with Deputy Miles beside him, both men looking grim. Behind them came Eli with the buckboard Mara had used the day before. The sheriff dismounted near the burned patch. "Morning, Jonah." "Sheriff." Darden's eyes flicked to Matthew. "Your boy." "My son." Matthew straightened, pushing emotion back behind his coat buttons. "Matthew Whitaker." The sheriff nodded, then crouched near the fence line. Deputy found tracks east of the wash just after first light. 2 riders, 1 horse with a split shoe. Jonah's eyes narrowed. Cresswell keeps a horse with a split shoe. Half the county might. But listen. Darden stood and removed his hat. "We found another strip of blue cloth snagged on mesquite near the old quarry road." Matthew frowned. What does that mean? It means whoever came here may have headed toward Broken Star territory. Jonah did not look surprised. Matthew did. Wade Cresswell. You know him? Jonah asked. Freight work, Matthew said slowly. He hired my wagons twice last spring, paid in cash, asked questions about ranches along the wash. What kind of questions? Matthew's face tightened. Who owned them, who had heirs, who might sell if pressed hard enough. Jonah stared at him. The sheriff did too. You did not think to mention this. I didn't know he was burning barns, Matthew snapped, then stopped. Shame pulled his voice lower. I thought he was only looking to expand. Darden rubbed a hand over his jaw. Expansion can wear many coats. A silence settled over the yard. Mara was walking somewhere on the road to town with a burned hand because Matthew had made the porch feel colder than the dawn. Jonah knew it. Matthew knew it too, though he tried not to show it. Then Eli cleared his throat from beside the buckboard. Mr. Whitaker, I can fetch Mrs. Bell if you want. She shouldn't be walking all that way. Jonah looked toward the road. Matthew's mouth tightened again, but this time the anger was turned inward. I'll go, he said. Jonah studied him. Will you apologize? Matthew looked down at the dust on his boots. Pride fought him. Grief fought him harder. But somewhere beneath both stood the boy who had once carried hurt sparrows into Ruth's kitchen and asked if broken things could live. Yes, he said quietly, I'll apologize. If you believe a second chance can begin with one honest apology, stay with this story, because Matthew's ride into town would uncover a secret Mara had been keeping from everyone. Matthew mounted again and rode toward Mercy Ridge. He found Mara halfway there, walking beside the road with her bandaged hand held close and her face lifted against the morning wind. She stopped when she heard him approach, but she did not step aside like a frightened woman. Matthew reined in. For a moment, he did not know how to begin. Then he removed his hat. Mrs. Bell, he said, voice rough, I spoke poorly. Yes, Mara said. The plain answer surprised him. He looked down, almost smiling despite himself. I deserved that. You deserved worse, but I am tired. He nodded. My mother loved that house. I know. No, Matthew said, looking back toward the ranch. I mean, I think maybe I loved the house because I could pretend she was still waiting in it. And when I saw you there, I felt as if someone had opened a door I wanted kept shut. Mara's expression softened, but her voice stayed firm. Your mother is not less loved because your father was not alone last night. Matthew closed his eyes briefly. I know that in my head. Then give your heart time to catch up. He let out a breath. Would you ride back? Pa will worry until he sees you. Mara hesitated. Before she could answer, a wagon rolled fast around the bend from town. Eliza, her pregnant niece, held the reins with one hand and waved a folded paper with the other. Aunt Mara, she called, breathless, this came for you at Harlan S. Mara's face changed the moment she saw the paper. Not fear exactly. Recognition. Matthew noticed. Eliza pulled the wagon up and handed it down. No name on it, just yours. Mara unfolded the note. Jonah's name was not written there, but the warning was clear enough. Stay away from Cottonwood Bend, or the next fire starts at your door. Matthew saw the blood leave Mara's face. And in that instant, he understood that whatever had come for his father's ranch had now come for her too. Mara read the note twice, though the first reading had been enough. Stay away from Cottonwood Bend, or the next fire starts at your door. The morning road seemed to fall silent around her. Eliza sat in the wagon seat with one hand pressed against the curve of her stomach, her worried eyes moving between Mara and Matthew. Matthew still sat on his horse beside the road, hat in hand, the apology he had come to make now replaced by something heavier. Mara folded the note carefully. That carefulness frightened Matthew more than tears would have. "Mrs. Bell," he said, "you need to come back to the ranch with me." "No." Eliza leaned forward. "Aunt Mara." "No," Mara said again, gently this time. "If a man threatens to burn my door, I will not hide behind Jonah S." Matthew's jaw tightened. "This is not about pride." "It is exactly about pride, Mr. Whitaker, but not mine." She looked toward the hills, where the morning sun had begun to sharpen every ridge and shadow. "Whoever wrote this believes lonely people can be frightened into giving up what little they still claim. Your father's ranch, my peace, maybe something else before that. If I run now, he learns the lesson he came to teach." Eliza's voice trembled. "And if he comes to your house, then he will find Sheriff Darden waiting nearby, if your horse is quick enough to fetch him." Matthew studied her then, truly studied her. He had seen a widow on his father's porch and turned her into a threat because grief had made him unfair. Now he saw the woman herself, dust on the hem of her dress, a bandage around one hand, her shoulders square beneath a night without sleep, fear in her face, yes, but not surrender. For the first time, he understood why his father had looked at her, as if the world had handed him back a piece of daylight. "I was wrong about you," Matthew said. Mara glanced at him. "Yes." A faint, tired smile tugged at his mouth. "You have a habit of not softening the truth." "I have spent too many years softening it for other people." Eliza helped Mara into the wagon, and Matthew rode beside them back toward Mercy Ridge instead of Cottonwood Bend. By the time they reached town, Sheriff Darden had already heard from Jonah about the threat at the ranch and was preparing to ride the road. When Matthew showed him Mara's note, the sheriff's weathered face settled into a hard frown. "Same pencil," Darden said. "Same hand near enough." Mara stood in front of Harlan's dry goods while neighbors watched from windows and doorways. Word traveled fast in Mercy Ridge, carried by worry and sharpened by imagination. Sheriff Darden folded the paper and tucked it into his vest. "Mrs. Bell, I'll post Deputy Miles near your place tonight." "I am grateful." "You should stay with your niece until this is settled." Mara looked at Eliza's pale face. "My niece needs calm, not danger under her roof." Eliza began to protest, but Mara touched her arm. "I will not be foolish, but I will not let a stranger decide where I belong." Matthew looked down the street toward the telegraph office. "Sheriff, Cresswell has shipments moving through my freight yard next week. If he is behind this, there may be papers, names, payments, men who know something." Darden's eyes narrowed. "You willing to look?" Matthew nodded. "I am willing to do more than look." That was when Jonah rode into town. He came in fast enough to raise dust, then slowed the moment he saw Mara standing safe outside the store. Relief crossed his face before he could hide it. Matthew noticed, and so did half the town. Jonah dismounted and went straight to Mara. "You should not have walked. You should not have tried to send me home in the dark. That is not the same thing." "No, mine was more reasonable." For one strange moment, with threats folded in the sheriff's pocket and half the street pretending not to stare, Jonah almost smiled. Then he saw Mara's face and the smile died. "Matthew told me." She handed him nothing. The sheriff already had the note, but Jonah knew. His voice dropped. "He threatened you." "He threatened my door." "That is near enough." Jonah turned toward Sheriff Darden. "I'm riding to Broken Star." "No, you're not," Darden said. "Not on temper and no proof. I've got a burned hay shed and a note. You've got enough for caution, not enough to accuse a man with money, riders, and lawyers." Jonah stepped close. "You expect me to sit while Mara waits for fire at her house. I expect you to use your head before your heart gets someone hurt." The words struck Jonah silent. Mara saw the flinch in him, his heart. He had guarded it so long that hearing someone name it in the open street seemed to leave him bare. She stepped nearer. "Jonah." He looked at her. "I am frightened," she said, quietly enough that only those closest could hear. "But I am not asking you to become reckless for me." His hands opened and closed at his sides. "Then what are you asking?" Mara's eyes held his. "Stand with me, not in front of me so I cannot see, not behind me so I must carry this alone, with me." The street seemed to pause. Matthew looked away, ashamed again, though not of her this time. He was ashamed because he had never heard anyone speak to his father like that, and because some part of him knew his mother might have. Jonah's face softened in a way Mara had not seen before. Not surrender, trust. "All right," he said, "with you." Those two words moved through Mara with more warmth than any grand promise could have. By noon, a plan formed around the sheriff's desk. Matthew would ride back to Prescott and quietly inspect records tied to Wade Cresswell's freight orders. Sheriff Darden would speak with Miller, the other rancher whose place had nearly burned. Deputy Miles would watch Mara's rented house at night. Jonah would stay at Cottonwood Bend but send word at once if any rider crossed his land. Mara was given the safest instruction of all. "Do nothing." She accepted it with a calm face and no intention of obeying fully. That afternoon, she returned to Harlan's dry goods because fear had stolen enough of the day already. Her burned hand throbbed beneath its bandage, and every time the door opened, her eyes lifted too quickly. But she measured sugar, wrapped thread, and smiled at customers who came in mostly to see if she was still standing. Near closing, old Mrs. Hanley entered with the stiff posture of a woman carrying news she had helped spread and now regretted. "I suppose you heard I wrote to Matthew Whitaker," Mrs. Hanley said. Mara folded a piece of calico. "I did. I thought his father needed looking after." "Did you?" Mrs. Hanley's mouth pinched. "A man alone can be taken advantage of." Mara looked at her steadily. "So can a woman who is tired of being useful to everyone except herself." The older woman's eyes flickered. For the first time, her certainty seemed to falter. She bought 2 spools of black thread she did not need and left without another word. When Harlan closed the shop, Mara stepped out into the cooling evening. Deputy Miles waited across the street as promised, pretending to check his saddle cinch. The sky was pink over the roofs of Mercy Ridge. Lanterns glowed in windows. Somewhere, a child laughed, and the sound cut through the day's fear like a small bell. Mara started toward her rented house. Halfway there, she noticed something tucked beneath the door. Not another threat. A small brown paper parcel. Deputy Miles hurried over as she stopped. "Don't touch it, ma'am." He opened it carefully with his knife, while Mara stood back. Inside was a piece of lavender. Dried, brittle, tied with blue thread. Mara's breath caught. Deputy Miles frowned. "Means something to you." She did not answer at once. The lavender in her own clay pot had died before she reached Mercy Ridge. She had carried it across miles of road because Abram had planted it for her years ago, and because throwing it away had felt like admitting something final. No one in town knew that story. No one except Eliza. And one other person. Years before, when Abram was still alive, Mara and her husband had passed once through a mining camp near the Verd River. A young bookkeeper there had admired the lavender sprig pinned to Mara's shawl. He had said his mother used to grow it. Abram had given him a cutting wrapped in damp cloth, and Mara remembered the young man's smile because it had been too hungry for such a small kindness. His name came back to her slowly. Nathan Vale. She had not thought of him in nearly 12 years. That evening, after Deputy Miles escorted her to Eliza's house instead of letting her sleep alone, Mara told Jonah what she remembered. He had ridden into town at dusk and stood in Eliza's small sitting room, hat in hand, while Mara spoke. Nathan Vale was no outlaw then, she said. Only a thin young man with ink on his cuffs. He worked accounts for a mine owner. Quiet, watchful. He asked Abram too many questions about land deeds and widow claims, but I thought him lonely, not dangerous. Jonah's eyes darkened. And now he sends lavender to your door. I do not know that it was him. But you fear it. Mara looked down at her bandaged hand. Yes. Eliza sat beside her, pale and silent. Matthew had already ridden out for Prescott, carrying Nathan Vale's name along with Cresswell's. Sheriff Darden had promised to search old records by morning. Jonah crossed the room and stopped before Mara. For a moment, he seemed unsure what comfort he had any right to offer. Then he reached into his coat pocket and drew out something wrapped in cloth. I brought this, he said. Mara unfolded it. One of the apple cakes. Misshapen, a little dark at the edges, still smelling faintly of cinnamon. Despite everything, she laughed softly. Jonah looked embarrassed. It ain't good. No, she said, eyes shining, it is not. Eliza covered her mouth, smiling for the first time all day. Jonah's face warmed. You needn't agree so quick. Mara broke the cake in half and handed one piece back to him. Stay a while. He looked at the offered piece, then at her. I will, he said. If this quiet little moment made you smile, leave a like for Jonah and Mara, because sometimes love does not arrive with perfect words. Sometimes it comes burned at the edges and wrapped in cloth. Later that night, after Jonah left under the sheriff's escort and Eliza finally slept, Mara sat by the window with the dried lavender on the table before her. The moon painted the blue thread silver. She touched it once and whispered the name again. Nathan Vale. Outside, beyond the lamplit street, a man stood in the shadow of the closed blacksmith shop, watching her window. When Mara looked up, he stepped back into darkness. But not before she saw the pale flash of a brass button on his sleeve. The man in the shadow was gone before Mara could call out. For one breath, she remained frozen by Eliza's window, her fingers still touching the dried lavender on the table. The room behind her was quiet. Eliza slept at last in the bedroom, one hand curved protectively over her unborn child. The lamp flame trembled beside the Bible on the small table, making the walls look as if they were breathing. Mara leaned closer to the glass. The blacksmith shop across the street stood dark. The alley beside it was empty. A loose sign moved once in the night wind with a small wooden groan, nothing else. But she had seen him. A man with a pale brass button on his sleeve. The same kind of button that had hung from the torn blue cloth near Jonah's burned fence. Mara backed from the window and reached for the bell Eliza kept beside the door to summon help. Her hand closed around it, then stopped. If she rang it, Deputy Miles would come. The sheriff would be told. Jonah might be woken and brought riding hard into town with worry in his face and danger waiting in the dark. That was exactly what the watcher wanted, she realized. Not only fear. Division, confusion, men running wild in the wrong direction. Mara set the bell down softly. She went to the writing desk instead and wrote 2 lines on a scrap of paper. Man watching from Blacksmith Alley, blue sleeve, brass button. She folded it, stepped into the hall, and woke Eliza's hired boy, Thomas, who slept in a small back room off the kitchen. Take this to Deputy Miles, she whispered. Quietly. Do not cross the street. Go through the wash path and come up behind the livery. The boy rubbed his eyes, saw her face, and woke fully. Yes, ma'am. Mara watched him slip out the back door. Only then did her knees begin to weaken. She sat down slowly. The lavender lay on the table like a memory turned into a warning. Nathan Vale. The name had opened a door in her mind she had not known was locked. She remembered him now in pieces. A thin young man in a dusty mining office, always standing near the record shelves. Ink-stained cuffs, careful eyes. A voice too smooth when he asked Abram whether widows usually held deeds after husbands died, or whether sons had stronger claims. Abram had laughed it off at the time, and said a decent man did not ask such things unless he meant to help someone. Nathan had smiled and said, "Help comes in many shapes." Mara had disliked the answer, but life had carried her onward. Now, 12 years later, that answer seemed to have followed her all the way to Mercy Ridge. By dawn, the town was awake with quiet alarm. Sheriff Darden came first, his face still creased from interrupted sleep. Deputy Miles followed with Thomas and confirmed the boy had delivered Mara's note in time for him to circle the blacksmith shop. He had found fresh boot prints in the alley and one horse track behind the far shed. "A split shoe?" Mara asked. Darden looked at her sharply. Deputy Miles nodded, "Left hind." The sheriff removed his hat and rubbed his forehead, same as the tracks near Cottonwood Bend. Eliza sat pale at the table while Mara poured coffee with steady hands. The sheriff watched those hands for a moment, perhaps wondering how much steadiness was real and how much was will. "Mrs. Bell," he said, "I want you out of town today just for a while." "No." "Mara," Eliza pleaded. The sheriff sighed. "I admire backbone, ma'am, but I do not admire offering yourself as bait." "I am not offering myself. I am refusing to be pushed." "There's a narrow bridge between the two." "Then help me cross it wisely." Before Darden could answer, hoofbeats sounded outside. Jonah arrived in the gray morning light, coat thrown over his shirt and his hat low over eyes that had not slept much either. He stepped into Eliza's front room, saw Mara safe, and breathed once as if he had been holding that breath all the way from the ranch. "You saw him?" he asked. "A shadow only." "A shadow with a brass button," Deputy Miles said. Jonah looked at the sheriff. "Cresswell's men wear blue coats." "Some do," Darden said. "So do half the teamsters who pass through town." Mara turned to Jonah. "I remembered more about Nathan Vale." At the name, Jonah's gaze sharpened. She told him what she had remembered in the night, the mining office, the questions about deeds, the way Nathan had studied Abram's papers when he thought no one noticed, the lavender cutting Abram had given him, the strange, hungry smile. When she finished, Jonah stood very still. "What is it?" Mara asked. "I know that name." The room changed. Sheriff Darden straightened. "From where?" Jonah's eyes moved toward the window, but Mara knew he was looking into the past. 7 years ago, after Ruth died, a man came by the ranch asking if I meant to sell. Said he represented investors out of Tucson. I told him no. He asked whether my children had interest in the land. I told him that was none of his concern. "Was it Vale?" I did not remember until now. He used another first name, Nathaniel maybe, but Vale, yes. Jonah's voice grew rough. He stood right there on my porch and told me lonely land had a way of becoming wasted land. Mara closed her eyes briefly. Lonely ranches, widow claims, water rights, old places left empty. This was no random cruelty. Someone had been studying grief as if it were a map. That afternoon, Matthew's telegram arrived from Prescott. Sheriff Darden read it aloud in his office while Jonah, Mara, Eliza, and Deputy Miles listened. Cresswell freight records show payments to N. Vale, listed as land agent, multiple deliveries to Broken Star, found note referencing Whitaker, Miller, Bell, returning by evening train. Mara sat down slowly. Jonah took one step toward her but stopped, as if remembering her words. "With me, not in front of me." So instead of hovering, he pulled a chair beside hers and sat. "Bell," Mara whispered, "why my name?" The sheriff folded the telegram. "Maybe because you witnessed the fire." No, she said. The lavender came before anyone in town could know what I remembered. He knew me already. Jonah's face darkened. Then he has been watching longer than we thought. Eliza began to cry quietly, more from strain than panic. Mara reached for her hand, but Eliza shook her head. No, Aunt Mara, she said through tears. You always comfort everyone else first, not today. The words struck Mara harder than she expected. Eliza wiped her eyes. You came here to help me, and I let you because you always make it easy to need you, but you are allowed to need someone too. Mara looked down at her bandaged hand. For most of her life, she had believed usefulness was the price of being loved. If she cooked enough, mended enough, soothed enough, gave up enough, then no one could accuse her of taking too much room in the world. Even Abram, dear as he had been, had leaned on that part of her. Everyone had. Then Jonah came along with his burned apple cake and clumsy worry and eyes that looked at one small hurt as if it mattered. And she had almost stepped back from it out of habit. Mara turned to him. I'm afraid, she said. Jonah's voice softened. I know. I do not only mean a veil. He waited. I am afraid that if I want a life of my own now, people will think I have become selfish too late. Jonah looked at her with such quiet sorrow that her throat tightened. Mara, he said, if wanting a chair by another person's table is selfish, then I have been selfish every night for 7 years and too proud to admit it. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. Jonah did not wipe it away. He did not reach too fast or make a show of tenderness in front of the room. He only set his hand on the table between them, palm open. Mara looked at it. Then she placed her fingers over his. Eliza let out a soft breath. Even Sheriff Darden looked away, pretending to study the telegram. That evening, Matthew returned on the train with dust in his coat and worry in his eyes. He came straight from the depot to the sheriff's office, carrying a folded ledger page hidden inside his vest. I copied what I could, he said. Cresswell paid Vale to pressure 5 properties along the Wash: Miller, Whitaker, the old Jensen place, a widow named Pearl Abbott, and Mara. Mara frowned. I own no land here. No, Matthew said, but Abram Bell did once. The room went still. Mara's face went pale. That cannot be right. Matthew unfolded the paper. According to this, Abram bought a narrow parcel years ago near the upper spring, small enough no one noticed, but that spring feeds the Wash in dry months. Jonah turned toward her. Did you know? No, her voice was barely there. Abram handled those papers when we traveled. He never told me. Maybe he meant to surprise you, Eliza said softly. Or protect it, Sheriff Darden muttered. If that deed passed to you after his death, Cresswell cannot control the full water line without your signature. Mara stared at the copied ledger until the numbers blurred. For years she had believed she owned almost nothing but 2 trunks, a sewing basket, and a dead lavender plant. Now men were threatening fire because of land she had never known was hers. Jonah's hand tightened gently around hers. We will find the deed. Mara looked at him. Where? Matthew answered before Jonah could. Vale may already have it, or he may be trying to scare you into signing something before you learn it exists. Sheriff Darden reached for his gun belt. Then we move before he does. Deputy, send word to Judge Haskell. Matthew, you stay close. Jonah, no riding off alone. Jonah gave him a hard look. Darden raised a brow. That was not a suggestion. Outside, thunder rolled faintly, though the sky above town was clear. Summer storms sometimes broke over the far ridge and sent water rushing down dry washes without warning. Mara rose, still holding the lavender-tied parcel. I need to go to my house, she said. Everyone objected at once. She lifted her voice just enough to quiet them. Abram's old travel Bible is in my trunk. He kept notes in it, receipts, names. If he hid mention of that parcel anywhere, it may be there. Jonah stood. Then we go together. Mara met his eyes. Together. The word felt different now, not like defiance, like a promise neither had yet dared to name. They reached Mara's small rented house near sunset with Sheriff Darden and Matthew close behind. Deputy Miles watched the street. Eliza stayed safely at the office. Mara unlocked the door. Inside, the room looked untouched at first. The clay pot of dead lavender sat near the window. Her sewing basket rested beside the chair. The evening light lay across the floor in long golden bars. Then Jonah saw the trunk. Its lock had been broken. Mara crossed the room quickly and lifted the lid. Clothes had been tossed aside, letters scattered. Her husband's old travel Bible was gone. On top of the torn lining lay a single brass button. And beneath it, written in black pencil on the bare wood of the trunk, were 5 words. "The past belongs to me." Jonah looked at the words carved by pencil into the bottom of Mara's trunk. "The past belongs to me." For a long moment, no one in the room spoke. The little house, which had once seemed plain and harmless, now felt violated in every corner. Mara's folded dresses lay scattered like wounded birds. Her letters had been opened and dropped across the floor. A small box of buttons had been overturned near the bed. Even the dead lavender in the clay pot seemed to lean away from the window, as if it too had seen the hand that came inside. Mara stood over the broken trunk without moving. Jonah wanted to put himself between her and the damage, but there was no enemy in the room to face. Only evidence, only insult, only a message meant to reach deep enough to turn memory into fear. Matthew picked up the brass button with his handkerchief. Same kind. Sheriff Darden nodded grimly. Blue coat, brass buttons, split shoe. Vale is getting careless, or he wants us to know. "He wants Mara to know," Jonah said. Mara's face stayed calm, but her voice had gone thin. "He took Abram's Bible." Jonah turned to her. "We will get it back." She looked at the empty place in the trunk where the Bible had always rested. It held his handwriting, notes from places we passed, the dates of rains, little sums he thought mattered, a pressed violet from the year we married. Her lips trembled once before she steadied them. It held more than papers. "I know." This time, she did not argue that he could not know. She had seen the photograph on his mantel, the chair at his table, the way he guarded an old rosebush as if roots could remember love. Jonah understood better than most what a stolen object could carry. Sheriff Darden stepped toward the window and looked into the street. Vale may still be close. Matthew frowned. "Why leave the button?" "To frighten," Darden said. "No," Mara said quietly. All 3 men looked at her. She bent down and studied the trunk lining, careful not to touch the pencil marks. Then she picked up one of Abram's scattered letters and held it near the lamp. Her bandaged hand shook, but her eyes sharpened with thought. "Nathan Vale asked too many questions years ago," she said. "Not because he was bold, because he was careful. A careful man does not leave buttons behind unless he must." Jonah's brow drew low. "You think he lost it?" "I think he was interrupted." Darden turned from the window. "By whom?" Mara moved toward the clay pot near the sill. The dead lavender stems were bent, but one broken piece lay on the floor beneath the window. She knelt, lifted the curtain, and saw a smear of dark mud on the inside wall. "He came through here," she said, "or tried to leave through here." Matthew crossed quickly, window latches scratched. Jonah stepped outside with the sheriff. They circled beneath the window where evening shadows had gathered thick near the wall. The soil there was trampled. One set of prints was deep and narrow. Another was smaller with a broken heel. Darden crouched. 2 people. Matthew joined them. "Vale and who?" Jonah looked toward the alley behind the house. Someone else wanted that Bible. Mara stood in the doorway, arms folded against the chill that had nothing to do with weather. Pearl Abbott. Darden looked up, the widow on Matthew's ledger. She came into Harlan's twice this week, Mara said. First for thread, then for matches. She asked me whether I had family in town, whether my papers were safe, whether I kept valuables at home. I thought she was lonely. Maybe she was warning you, Matthew said. Or searching for the same deed, Jonah replied. Sheriff Darden rose. Pearl lives near the old Jensen Road. If Vale threatened her too, she may have run before we knew to ask. Thunder sounded again, nearer this time. A wind moved down the street, carrying the smell of rain from the upper hills. Mercy Ridge rarely feared rain, but every rancher in the valley knew a storm over dry country could turn washes into rivers before a man finished saddling his horse. Darden made his choice quickly. Matthew, take Mrs. Bell to Eliza's. Jonah, ride with me to Pearl Abbott's place. No, Mara said. Jonah turned slowly. She met his eyes before he could speak. We said together, this may not be safe. None of this is safe. That is not the measure anymore. Matthew shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Bell, if Vale is there. If Vale is there, he knows my face, my name, and my fear already. I will not let every man in Mercy Ridge decide my courage for me. Sheriff Darden looked from her to Jonah. I can order my deputy. I cannot order Mrs. Bell. Jonah's jaw worked. Mara stepped closer, lowering her voice so only he heard. Do not make me fight you just to stand beside you. That reached him. His face changed, not pleased, not easy, but he nodded once. Beside me, he said. Mara gave the smallest smile. Beside you. They rode out before full dark, 4 horses moving fast along the old Jensen Road, with Matthew following close and Sheriff Darden leading. The wind grew sharper. Dust lifted in restless sheets. The sky beyond the ridge flashed white, and a few seconds later thunder rolled wide over the land. Mara rode a gentle mare borrowed from Eliza's neighbor, her skirt pinned for travel, her burned hand wrapped close to her body. Jonah kept turning his head to check on her, but after the 3rd time she raised one eyebrow, he faced forward and trusted her seat. The road narrowed after 2 miles, winding through mesquite and rock toward a lonely stretch where abandoned fence posts leaned like tired men. Pearl Abbott's cabin sat near a dry wash, with one cottonwood tree behind it and a shed tilting badly to one side. No lamp burned inside. Darden lifted a hand, and they slowed. The front door hung open. Jonah dismounted first. Mara followed before he could help her down. He noticed but said nothing. Pearl Abbott, the sheriff called. No answer. They entered carefully. The cabin was poor but tidy. A quilt folded on the bed, a cracked cup beside the stove, a Bible on the table but not Abraham's. A small trunk stood open near the wall, empty except for a shawl and a child's wooden horse with one missing wheel. Matthew picked up a paper from the floor. Sheriff. Darden held it to the last gray light at the window. Pearl's handwriting was shaky but clear. I took the book because Vale said it was the only thing keeping my land safe. I did not know it belonged to Mrs. Bell until I opened it. He lied to me. He said widows had to choose who got ruined first. I am taking it to the upper spring before he can. If I do not come back, ask forgiveness for me. Mara pressed a hand to her chest. She has Abraham's Bible. Jonah looked toward the storm-dark hills, the upper spring. Darden swore under his breath, not loudly, but with feeling. That wash floods first when rain hits the ridge. A flash of lightning lit the cabin. In that white second, Mara saw something else on the table beneath Pearl's note. A scrap of blue cloth, torn hard, no button this time. She fought him, Mara said. Jonah looked at the cloth, then at the open door. Rain began to strike the roof in heavy drops. Sheriff Darden moved fast. If Pearl is headed to the spring, Vale may be behind her. We ride now. They mounted in the rain. The storm came all at once, as frontier storms often did. Wind bent the grass flat. Rain turned dust to slick mud beneath the horses. Lightning showed the trail in hard white pieces, then stole it again. Mara kept her body low and trusted the mare's feet, while Jonah rode close enough to reach her if the horse stumbled. The upper spring lay beyond the ridge, hidden in a bowl of stone where water seeped even in dry months and fed the wash below. By the time they reached the rise above it, rain poured in silver ropes. A lantern moved below. Then a woman screamed. Jonah kicked Sunday forward. Pearl, Darden shouted. At the base of the rocks, Pearl Abbott struggled near the spring with a leather satchel clutched against her chest. She was small, soaked through, gray hair plastered to her face. A man in a dark blue coat had hold of her arm. Nathan Vale. Mara knew him despite the years, older now, fuller in the face, but the same careful eyes, the same hungry look, only sharpened by greed. "Let her go," Sheriff Darden shouted. Vale turned, dragging Pearl in front of him. Rain ran off the brim of his hat. One brass button was missing from his sleeve. "She stole from me," he called. Mara rode forward before Jonah could stop her. "No, you stole from widows and lonely men because you thought grief made them easy." Vale's eyes fixed on her. Recognition moved across his face like a match-taking flame. "Mara Bell." She lifted her chin. "Give me Abraham's Bible." Vale smiled. "Your husband should have kept better records if he meant to make you rich." "I do not want riches." "No, people like you never say you do." His grip tightened on Pearl. "But land is land, water is water, and old fools will burn before they give either up." Jonah moved beside Mara now, rifle low but ready. "You set fire to my ranch. I warned you to sell. You threatened her." Vale's smile thinned. She became inconvenient. The wash behind him began to roar. At first it sounded like wind in deep trees. Then the sound grew heavier, fuller, coming fast through the dark channel below the spring. Sheriff Darden heard it and shouted. "Floodwater!" Pearl cried out as the ground beneath her slipped. Vale tried to pull the satchel from her arms, but she held tight. The bank crumbled under the rushing water. Jonah dismounted and ran toward them. Darden followed. Matthew swung wide, trying to cut Vale off from the rocks. Mara saw what would happen before it did. Pearl lost her footing. Vale released her to save himself. The old woman slid toward the edge of the wash with the satchel still clutched in her arms. Mara did not think, she ran. Jonah shouted her name, but the rain swallowed it. Mara dropped to her knees in the mud and caught Pearl's wrist with her bandaged hand. Pain shot up her arm. Pearl screamed. The satchel slipped between them, leather strap caught around Mara's forearm. The flood roared inches below. Jonah reached them an instant later, seized Mara around the waist, and braced his boots against a rock. Matthew grabbed Jonah's coat from behind. Darden caught Pearl's other arm. Together, straining in mud and rain and fear, they pulled Pearl back from the wash. The satchel tore open as it dragged over stone. Abraham's travel Bible fell out, wrapped in oilcloth. So did a bundle of deeds, notes, and signed threats. The papers scattered in the rain. Vale lunged for them. Sheriff Darden drew his pistol. "Nathan Vale, stop where you stand." Vale froze. For one breath, the whole storm seemed to hold still. Then Matthew stepped from behind Jonah, holding one soaked paper in his hand. His face was pale with anger. "This has Cresswell's name on it," he said. Vale's eyes flicked toward the ridge. Jonah saw it. "He is here." A gunshot cracked from somewhere above them, striking stone near Darden's boot. The horses reared. Mara threw herself over Pearl. Jonah dropped beside Mara, shielding both women with his body as loose rock jumped from the impact. On the ridge, through rain and lightning, a rider turned his horse and vanished into the dark. Sheriff Darden fired once into the air, not to hit, but to stop panic. "Deputy, after him." But there was no deputy at the spring. Only storm, flood, and the truth at last spilling out of Abram's stolen Bible. If your heart is racing for Jonah and Mara, stay close now, because the man behind the threats has shown his face, and the next choice may cost them everything. Vale tried to run in the confusion. Matthew tackled him before he reached his horse. They hit the mud hard. Vale fought, but Matthew was younger, stronger, and full of every regret he had not known where to place. Jonah helped Darden bind Vale's hands with saddle rope. Mara sat in the rain with Pearl trembling against her, Abram's Bible held tight to her chest. Jonah came to her, soaked, breathing hard, eyes searching her face. "Are you hurt?" "Yes," she said, because she was too tired to pretend. His face broke with worry. Then she added, "But I am here." Jonah knelt in the mud before her, heedless of the rain, the sheriff, Matthew, the prisoner, and all the years that had taught him not to reach for what could be taken. He took her injured hand gently between both of his. "So am I," he said. Mara looked at him through rain and tears. And for the first time, neither of them looked away. By the time they brought Nathan Vale down from the upper spring, the storm had softened to a cold, steady rain. Mercy Ridge woke to the news before sunrise. Lanterns appeared in windows. Men stepped out onto porches pulling suspenders over their shirts. Women stood in doorways with shawls clutched tight around their shoulders. Children were told to stay inside, which only made them press their faces harder to the glass. Sheriff Darden rode at the front, hat low, coat soaked black with rain. Nathan Vale sat bound on Matthew's horse, his fine blue coat torn at the sleeve where the brass button had ripped away. Matthew rode beside him with a look so stern that no one mistook him for the same angry son who had arrived at Cottonwood Bend full of suspicion only days earlier. Behind them came Jonah, leading Mara's borrowed mare by the reins. Mara sat upright in the saddle, Abram's travel Bible held against her chest beneath Jonah's coat. Her bandaged hand throbbed from pulling Pearl Abbott back from the wash, but she would not let go of the Bible. Not yet. Not after the years it had crossed without her knowing what it carried. Not after the rain had nearly taken it into dark water. Pearl Abbott rode in the buckboard with Deputy Miles, wrapped in a blanket, trembling from cold and shame. "I should have known better," Pearl whispered for perhaps the 10th time. Mara turned in her saddle. "You were frightened. That does not make stealing right." "No," Mara said gently, "but it means you still have a chance to tell the truth." Pearl lowered her eyes. Jonah heard the words and looked at Mara with quiet wonder. Even hurt, exhausted, and threatened, she still found a way to leave a door open for someone else's courage. Not an excuse, not weakness, a door. He wondered how many doors she had held open for others, while leaving herself standing outside in the cold. At the sheriff's office, Judge Haskell was summoned from his bed, and Harlan opened the dry goods store early so women could bring blankets and coffee. By full morning, the whole town seemed to gather near the jail, though Sheriff Darden allowed only a few inside. The evidence was spread across his desk. Abram Bell's travel Bible, its oilcloth wrapping dark with rain, a bundle of deeds and water claims, letters signed by Wade Cresswell, notes written in Nathan Vale's hand, a list of ranches along the wash, each marked with a short phrase. Miller, old, no sons nearby. Whitaker, widower, stubborn, pressure with fire. Abbott, widow, afraid, use debt. Bell, hidden spring claim, obtain signature before she learns. Mara read that last line once and sat down. Hidden spring claim. The words looked too plain for the trouble they had caused. Abram had bought the narrow parcel near the upper spring 12 years ago, perhaps with the dream of someday giving Mara a small place with water and flowers and a porch of her own. He had tucked the deed into his Bible and never spoken of it, likely waiting for the right season. Then illness took him. The Bible went into Mara's trunk. The dream waited in silence. And men like Vale and Cresswell had found it before she did. Jonah stood behind Mara's chair, close enough that she could feel him there but not touching unless she asked. It was a new kind of care for him, harder than lifting beams, harder than facing fire. To let someone he cared for remain her own person in danger and still be ready if she reached. Sheriff Darden questioned Vale first. Vale sat with his wet hair combed back by his fingers, trying to look insulted rather than beaten. But his torn sleeve betrayed him. So did the missing button. So did the mud on his boots and the scratches across his jaw where mesquite had caught him. I acted as a legal agent, Vale said. Darden leaned back. Legal agents don't throw stones through windows. I know nothing of stones. Matthew stepped forward. You paid men to watch my father's ranch. Vale glanced at him. Your father refused fair offers. So you burned his hay line. Vale's eyes narrowed. A small fire can teach a large lesson. The room went still. Judge Haskell, who had been silent until then, lifted his head. You may wish to consider your next words carefully. Vale smiled faintly, but sweat shone near his temple. You all speak as if this valley is holy. It is land, water, paper. Men with sense understand that progress cannot wait on old grief. Jonah's hands curled at his sides. Mara turned before he could speak. Old grief. Vale's smile shifted toward her. Mrs. Bell, your husband understood value. He bought a water claim. Then he died before using it. You carried the proof for years without even knowing. What is that if not waste? Mara rose slowly. Jonah moved half a step, then stopped. Her voice was quiet. Abram was not wasting anything, he was hoping. Vale scoffed. Hope does not build towns. No, Mara said, but greed burns them. For the first time, Vale had no quick answer. Then Pearl Abbott asked to speak. She sat near the wall, blanket around her shoulders, face pale as candle wax. Her hands trembled so badly that Harlan's wife held the coffee cup for her. Mr. Vale came to me 3 weeks ago, Pearl said. He told me I owed more than I could pay on my late husband's accounts. Said Wade Cresswell could take my cabin by winter if I did not help him. Darden frowned. Help how? He said there was a widow in town with papers that belonged to Cresswell. He said the papers were stolen years ago. Her eyes filled as she looked at Mara. He told me Mrs. Bell had cheated another family and that taking the Bible would only set things right. Mara's face softened with pain, but she did not interrupt. Pearl went on. I found out he lied when I opened it. Abram Bell's name was in it. Mara's name too. I saw the deed. I meant to bring it back, but Vale came after me. I ran to the spring because I thought if I could reach the land itself, maybe the sheriff would understand. Her voice broke. I am sorry. Mara crossed the room. Pearl began to cry harder, expecting anger. Instead, Mara knelt in front of her. You should have come to me, Mara said. I was ashamed. So was I, many times in my life. Shame makes poor company and worse decisions. Pearl gave a tearful laugh that sounded more like a sob. Mara touched her shoulder. Tell the truth now, that is what you can still save. Jonah watched her from across the room, and love, though he did not yet dare call it that aloud, settled in him with a quiet strength. Not the wild rush of youth, not the hunger of a lonely man grabbing at warmth. This was different, wider, like morning spreading slowly over land that had endured a long night. By noon, Sheriff Darden had enough to hold Vail and send riders after Wade Cresswell. Matthew handed over copies from his freight ledgers and admitted before everyone that he had ignored signs because profit had looked harmless when it came dressed in paperwork. "That fault is mine," he said. Jonah looked at his son, surprised by the public confession. Matthew turned to him. "I should have asked more questions, and I should have come home before fear made me cruel." The room quieted. Jonah took a long breath. "I told you I was fine when I was not. That fault is mine." Matthew's face changed. For years, father and son had carried separate griefs like loaded saddlebags, each blaming himself in silence and the other in passing. Now, with the town watching and rain tapping on the jailhouse roof, the truth between them looked plain and tired and ready to be set down. Matthew stepped forward first. Jonah met him halfway. The embrace was awkward at first. Two grown men, both stiff with regret, both unused to needing the other. Then Matthew's hand gripped the back of his father's coat, and Jonah closed his eyes. Mara looked away to give them privacy, though tears warmed her own eyes. Later that afternoon, Wade Cresswell was brought in under guard. He was not dragged like an outlaw from a dime novel. He came seated straight on his horse, dressed in a dark wool coat, silver watch chain across his vest, anger hidden beneath polish. A man who had believed money could stand between him and consequence. Sheriff Darden met him outside the jail. Half the town gathered despite the rain. Cresswell looked at Jonah first, then Mara, then Vail through the barred window. "You have caused a great deal of noise over a misunderstanding," Cresswell said. Darden held up one of the signed letters. "Your misunderstanding has your name on it." "My agent acted beyond instruction." Nathan Vail shouted from inside, "You coward." That single word did more damage than any speech could have. Cresswell's face tightened. The town heard it. Judge Haskell heard it. Matthew heard it too and lifted another paper. "This payment bears your mark," Matthew said, "so do 3 more." Cresswell looked at him with cold contempt. "You were happy enough to haul my freight." Matthew did not flinch. "I was. That is why I am standing here now." Mara stepped forward then, Abraham's Bible in her arms. Cresswell's eyes flicked to it, and for the first time fear showed beneath his polish. "This spring claim is mine," Mara said, "not because I chased it, not because I knew its worth, because my husband left it in my keeping and I intend to honor that." Cresswell smiled thinly. "And what will a widow do with a water claim?" Mara looked toward Jonah, then Pearl, then the townspeople standing in the rain. She thought of all the lonely places marked in Vail's ledger. Old, widower, widow, afraid, stubborn. The words men had used to measure who could be pressed. "I will not sell it to you," Mara said. "That is what I will do first." A murmur moved through the street. Cresswell's jaw hardened. "And second," she continued, "I will speak with Judge Haskell about protecting shared access for the small ranches along the wash, so no one man can hold water over grieving people like a loaded gun." Jonah stared at her. So did Matthew. Pearl Abbott covered her mouth with one hand. Judge Haskell, standing beneath the awning, gave a slow nod. "That can be discussed." Cresswell's face darkened. "You do not understand business." Mara held Abraham's Bible tighter. "No, but I understand thirst." There was no cheer. Real justice rarely arrived like a parade. It came quieter than that, in papers handed over, in lies spoken aloud, in a rich man finally finding that a town could stand together when lonely people stopped believing they had to be lonely. Cresswell was taken inside. Vail stopped shouting. The rain eased. By evening, the clouds broke west of town, and a thin gold light spread over Mercy Ridge. The muddy streets shone like polished copper. People drifted home in small groups, talking low, as if something tender had been saved and they did not want to bruise it with too much noise. Mara stepped out of the sheriff's office at last, exhausted enough that her legs felt unsteady. Jonah waited beside Sunday with 2 horses ready. "You should rest at Eliza's," he said. "I will." He nodded. Neither moved. The sky behind him had gone soft with clearing light. Rain clung to the brim of his hat and the shoulders of his coat. He looked older than he had that first day on the church roof. Or perhaps Mara simply saw more of him now. The tiredness, the loyalty, the fear, the tenderness he had kept folded away like a letter he did not trust himself to open. "Jonah," she said. "Yes. I have spent most of my life being needed." He waited, eyes steady on hers. "I am grateful for the people I cared for. I loved them. But somewhere along the way, I began to think love was only the work I did for others." Her hand tightened around Abram's Bible. "When you worry over me, I do not feel useful." Jonah's voice came rough. "How do you feel?" Mara looked down, then back up. "Seen." The word passed between them, like a lantern being lit. Jonah stepped closer, slow enough that she could step back if she wished. She did not. "I see you, Mara Bell," he said. "Not because you saved my barn, not because you sat in my kitchen or brought warmth back into my house. I see you when you are tired, when you are afraid, when you are stubborn past reason, when you hold another person's sorrow so gently that you forget your own hands are bleeding." Her eyes filled. "And I am trying," Jonah continued, "to learn how to stand beside you without turning care into offense." Mara laughed softly through tears. "That may take practice." "I reckon most worthwhile things do." They stood there in the muddy street, close but not touching, while Mercy Ridge settled into evening around them. Then Matthew came from the sheriff's office, carrying a small wooden box. "Mrs. Bell," he said, "we found this in Vale's satchel." Mara opened it with careful fingers. Inside lay Abram's pressed violet, dry and fragile, saved from the travel Bible before the storm ruined it. Beside it was a folded note in Abram's handwriting, one Mara had never seen before. Her breath caught. Jonah's hand hovered near her shoulder, but did not land. "Read it," Matthew said gently. "It has your name." Mara unfolded the note. The paper had yellowed with time, but Abram's writing remained clear. "Mara, if I never find the right day to tell you, know this. I bought the spring land because you once said every woman deserves a porch with flowers and water close enough to hear. I meant to build that for you when the road stopped taking us from place to place. If I am gone before I do, promise me you will still make a home that belongs to your own heart." Mara pressed the note to her lips. For years, she had carried his Bible as a memory of what had ended. All that time, hidden inside it, Abram had been giving her permission to begin. Jonah read the truth on her face before she spoke. "What will you do?" he asked softly. Mara looked toward the dark road leading to Cottonwood Bend, then toward the hills where the upper spring waited, muddy and wild after the storm. Then back at Jonah, the man who had once believed his best years were buried behind him, just as she had believed her own life belonged mostly to duty. "I do not know all of it yet," she said. Jonah nodded. "You don't have to." A small smile touched her mouth. "But I know I want flowers." His eyes warmed. "And a porch," she added. "Yes. And supper that is not always beans." Jonah gave a tired, honest laugh. "Now you ask too much." Mara smiled fully then, and the sight of it struck him quiet. A bell rang once from the church roof they had helped mend, clear in the washed evening air. It was only the wind moving the rope, perhaps, or perhaps Mercy Ridge itself had taken a breath and let it out. Jonah offered his arm. This time Mara took it. They walked toward Eliza's house slowly, not as young lovers rushing toward certainty, but as two people old enough to know that every step mattered. Behind them, the sheriff locked the jail. In front of them, lamplight waited. And somewhere beyond town, at Cottonwood Bend Ranch, a single empty chair sat at Jonah's kitchen table, no longer feeling like a grave, only like a place being saved. The wedding took place on a clear Saturday morning, when the desert flowers had begun to open after the storm, and Mercy Ridge smelled of wet earth, fresh bread, and cottonwood leaves warming in the sun. It was not a grand wedding. Mara Bell would not have wanted one, and Jonah Whitaker would have survived one only by standing near the door and planning escape. So the town gave them what suited them best: the little white church with the mended roof, 2 rows of wildflowers in tin pitchers, a few lanterns unlit in the windows because the morning was bright enough on its own, a plain wooden table outside waiting for food, coffee, and every opinion Mercy Ridge could not keep to itself. Jonah stood at the front of the church in his dark coat, the one Ruth had once said made him look like he was headed to a funeral even when he was not. Matthew stood beside him, trying to appear calm and failing. Cole had ridden down from the north 2 days earlier, dust-covered and grinning, and Annie had arrived with her husband and children in a wagon so crowded with blankets, baskets, and little boots that it looked as if half of Santa Fe had come with her. Jonah had not expected all of them. When Annie climbed down from the wagon and ran to him, no longer a little girl but still somehow his little girl, Jonah held her so tight she laughed and cried at once. "Pa," she whispered, "you should have told us you were lonely." He closed his eyes. "I was afraid telling you would make it more true." Annie held his face between her hands. "It was true whether you told us or not." That answer stayed with him. So did Cole's quiet apology beside the barn that evening, and Matthew's steady presence at every chore without being asked. For several days, Cottonwood Bend had sounded like the ranch Jonah remembered. Children ran through the yard. Horses shifted at the rail. Supper plates clattered. Someone laughed in the kitchen. Someone else complained about smoke from Jonah's cooking. Nothing erased Ruth. That was the wonder of it. Her rosebush still grew by the porch, with new green leaves after the rain. Her photograph still sat on the mantel. Her sampler still hung near the stove. But the house no longer felt like a room holding its breath around her absence. It felt as if memory had finally been given windows. Mara arrived at the church with Eliza on one side and Pearl Abbott on the other. Pearl had asked to stand with her, voice trembling so hard Mara nearly cried before answering. Since the night at the spring, Pearl had told the full truth in front of Judge Haskell. She had also offered to work at Harlan's twice a week to repay what damage she could, though Mara told her forgiveness was not a debt ledger. Still, Pearl needed to give something back. Mara understood that need. She wore a simple cream dress Eliza had altered by lamplight, with small stitches so fine that even Harlan's wife admired them. In her hands, she carried no grand bouquet, only a few desert flowers tied with a strip of blue ribbon, and tucked among them, one stem of lavender newly planted from a cutting Eliza had found outside the apothecary. Not dead lavender this time. Living. When Jonah saw her in the church doorway, he forgot the people around him. For a moment he saw every road that had brought them there. The church roof where she had handed him food and scolded him like he was worth the trouble. The dry goods counter with cinnamon and nutmeg, smoke behind the barn, the note on the porch, her burned hand in a basin of water, rain at the upper spring, Abraham's Bible pressed to her chest, her voice in the muddy street saying she felt seen. Mara looked back at him and smiled. Not shyly, not like a girl starting life with no idea what sorrow could cost. She smiled like a woman who had known loss and chosen joy anyway. Jonah's throat tightened so sharply he had to look down. Matthew leaned close. "Breathe, Pa." Jonah muttered, "You tend your own breathing." But Matthew smiled. The preacher spoke gently that morning. He did not pretend they were young. He did not speak as if love belonged only to springtime hearts and untouched dreams. He spoke of harvest love too, love that came after drought, love that knew the price of loss and still planted, love that did not replace what had been but made room beside it. When he asked if anyone gave Mara, Eliza squeezed her aunt's hand. Mara answered for herself. "I come by my own choosing," she said. The church went quiet. Then Jonah, who had spent years deciding for others in the name of care, looked at her with pride so deep it changed his whole face. The vows were simple. Jonah promised not to hide behind silence when his heart needed speech. Mara promised not to disappear the moment someone else felt discomfort. Jonah promised one supper a week cooked by his own hand, which made his grandchildren whisper and giggle until Annie hushed them. Mara promised to tell him the truth when the supper failed. "That will be often," she added. Even the preacher laughed. Then Jonah took her bandaged hand, careful as ever. The burn had nearly healed, leaving only a faint red mark across her palm. He looked at it before slipping the ring on her finger. A small wound from the night she had helped save his barn. A small mark from the day she had refused to let Pearl fall. A small sign that love at their age was not untouched by danger, but brave enough to remain tender anyway. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Jonah did not rush. He lifted Mara's hand and kissed her knuckles first. The church fell silent around them. Then he kissed her forehead softly, with more reverence than hunger. Mara closed her eyes, and in that stillness, everyone present understood something words might have spoiled. They were not beginning because the past had ended. They were beginning because the past had taught them what a beginning was worth. Outside, the town gathered around the food tables. Harlan had brought coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. Mrs. Hanley arrived with 3 pies and an apology she had practiced so many times it came out stiff but sincere. "I wrote what I should not have written," she told Mara, "and I mistook concern for judgment." Mara accepted the apology with a nod. "We all do that sometimes." Mrs. Hanley glanced toward Jonah. "He does look happier." Mara smiled. "Do not tell him too often, he may become difficult." "He already was," Mrs. Hanley said. That made Mara laugh. Near the churchyard fence, Matthew found Jonah standing alone for a moment, watching Mara speak with Annie and Eliza. The younger children circled her like she had always belonged there. Matthew leaned beside his father on the rail. "I was afraid she would take Mother's place," he said. Jonah kept his eyes on Mara. "I know." "She didn't." "No." Matthew swallowed. "She made me remember Mother more kindly, not just the sickness, not just the empty chair after. I had forgotten how much she laughed." Jonah's face softened. "Your mother laughed with her whole face." "She would have liked Mara." Jonah was quiet. Then he said, "I think so too." It was the final truth Matthew had needed, and perhaps the final truth Jonah had feared most. That Ruth's memory was not a locked room. That love was not a single candle that went dark when another was lit. That a heart, even an old one, could hold more than one sacred name without betraying either. Across the yard, Mara opened Abram's travel Bible one last time before putting it safely in her trunk again. The pressed violet had been returned to its page, now protected beneath thin paper. Abram's note lay folded beside it. Eliza stood with her. "Are you sad?" she asked. Mara touched the page. "Yes." Eliza's face fell. Mara smiled gently. "But not only sad, that is what makes it bearable." She looked toward Jonah, who was pretending not to watch her and failing badly. "For years I thought grief was a room I had to keep swept and closed. but maybe it is more like a garden. Some things stay rooted. Some things bloom later. Both can live if we stop tearing up one to prove we love the other. Eliza rested her head on Mara's shoulder. You sound happy. Mara breathed in the warm scent of bread, flowers, dust, and coffee. I am learning how. Later, Judge Haskell confirmed what the town had already hoped. Mara's spring claim would be placed into a protected water agreement for the small ranchers along the wash. No single owner could cut the valley dry for profit. Pearl Abbott kept her cabin. Miller kept his herd watered. Cottonwood Bend kept its north pasture alive through the hot months. Wade Cresswell fought with lawyers, but signed papers and witness statements had louder voices than his money now. Nathan Vale confessed enough to save himself from harsher judgment, and in doing so buried Cresswell's respectability under the weight of his own ledgers. Their punishment came not through blood or vengeance, but through truth, law, and the town finally standing together. That was enough. The months that followed did not turn life into a perfect painting. Jonah still woke some mornings with Ruth's name near his lips. Mara still reached for Abraham's Bible when the wind sounded like wheels on a road. Matthew still carried guilt, though he visited more often now and brought his children with him when he could. Jonah still burned supper more than any man had a right to. But Cottonwood Bend changed. Mara planted flowers along the porch rail, desert marigolds, lavender, a row of hardy red blooms Annie brought from Santa Fe. She planted them beside Ruth's rosebush, not over it. The rosebush climbed higher that year than it had in many seasons, as if pleased by the company. Jonah built a bench beneath the cottonwood tree. It leaned a little to one side, and Mara said so. He told her it was made that way so prideful people would sit closer together. She told him that was the worst excuse for poor carpentry she had ever heard. Then she sat beside him anyway. On Sundays, both chairs at the kitchen table were used. Sometimes every chair was used. Grandchildren argued over biscuits. Cole told stories too large to be fully true. Annie helped Mara make apple cakes properly, while Matthew and Jonah repaired the barn door and spoke of freight, weather, and things that mattered more. One evening, months after the wedding, Jonah stood on the porch with Mara as sunset turned the hills copper. The flowers moved in the wind. Sunday grazed near the corral. A lantern burned in the kitchen window, not because the house looked dead without it, but because someone inside would soon call them to supper. Jonah rested one hand on the porch rail. I was wrong. Mara looked at him. About the bench. About many things, the bench included. She smiled. Which wrongness troubles you tonight? He looked over the land, then down at the flowers growing beside Ruth's rosebush. I thought my best years were behind me. Mara grew still. The old words returned between them, no longer heavy the same way. They had once been a wall. Now they were only a marker showing how far he had come. And now, she asked. Jonah took her hand, the one with the faint scar across the palm. Now I think some years wait, until a man is humble enough to receive them. Mara's eyes shone in the sunset light. For a while neither spoke. They did not need to. The porch held their silence easily now. Not the old silence of loneliness, but the full silence of two people watching the same sky. If Jonah and Mara's story found a place in your heart, share your thoughts in the comments and stay close for more romantic Wild West stories where love, courage, and healing meet on the frontier. Inside the house, a child laughed. From the kitchen, Annie called, Pa, did you put cinnamon in the beans again? Jonah closed his eyes. Mara looked at him slowly. He cleared his throat. That may have happened. She laughed then, bright and free, and Jonah felt the sound settle into the boards of the porch, into the flowers, into the old ranch house, into every room that had once seemed finished. He turned toward the door with her hand in his. Ruth's rosebush climbed beside Mara's lavender. Abram's note rested safe in the Bible. The spring water ran clear through the valley. The mended church roof shone white in the distance. Nothing loved had been lost by loving again. And as Jonah Whitaker stepped into the warm kitchen beside Mara, with both chairs waiting at the table and no one in any hurry to leave, he understood at last that the heart does not count its years the way the world does. Sometimes the best ones begin after a man has stopped believing they can.